Two true creepy, scary hospital horror stories, YouTube, English. Story 1: The Terrifying Medical Procedure. When I was 7 years old, I contracted spinal meningitis. I was barely old enough to understand how close to death I was because of the disease, let alone did I have a clue what was about to happen to me during treatment. My mother took me to the hospital and told the doctors to do whatever they needed to do to save my life. They required a spinal tap before continuing treatment, and the look on my mother's face when they said that told me everything I needed to know. Despite the fact that I had no idea what a spinal tap was, I remember my mother pleading with the doctors to find some way to make the procedure less traumatic for me. For some reason, they couldn't put me under general anesthesia. Instead, they offered a new experimental treatment on humans at the time, intravenous ketamine. My mother had never heard of the drug before, and my father wasn't there. They explained that it was traditionally used as a horse tranquilizer, but had recently been approved for use in humans, even in pediatric care. Ever since, my mom swears up and down that's all they told her about it. Maybe it was a time-sensitive case, or maybe the doctors thought if they told her everything that was involved with being under the influence of the drug, then she would refuse to let me have it, which in their minds would make the spinal tap harder to go through. Frankly, it boggles my mind that doctors would even consider giving ketamine to a child, but that's what happened. They wheeled me into the operating room and told me what was going to happen. That I would have to lay on my side, and they would insert a needle into my back. It would feel extremely uncomfortable. I know that's what they said now, but at the time, I was so disoriented and scared that it all sounded like gibberish. It was like how adults sound in Charlie Brown when they just go wah wah wah, if you know what I mean. All the doctors and nurses were wearing masks and gowns, which made them look almost inhuman. I had to get naked and put on a hospital gown, adding to the stress of it all because I had to be exposed to a bunch of strangers. The only thing that kept me sane was that my mother was allowed to be there with me so I could hold her hand. However, before they did the tap, they inserted the 4-needle into my arm to deliver the ketamine. I cried and screamed, and I remember squirming just from having that needle put in me, and I didn't even understand how much bigger the next one would be. Then they turned me over to my side, and I held my mother's hand, squeezing harder than before, looking into her eyes and crying, trying to be brave and sit still. At first, all I could feel on my back was a cold hospital bed, but then something happened. Everything started to feel weird. Of course, I know now that this was the ketamine beginning to take effect, but I didn't understand this at the time. An all-encompassing dread washed over my body, which I also felt like I was losing control of, like my soul was slipping away second by second. Then it literally did feel like I was dying and rising up to heaven. I was lifted up from the table and could see my own body and everyone around. What I saw filled me with a mixture of terror and hatred. The doctor was lining up the needle against my back, and for the first time, I saw how massive the thing was. There was my mother watching it all happen, letting them do it. Suddenly, I knew I couldn't go through with it anymore. I screamed and kicked and punched at everything around me, hell-bent on getting off of that table and running away. The nurses tried to hold me down, but they were struggling to keep me contained. Somebody called for more help, and that's when two gigantic muscular nurses rushed in and grabbed hold of me, then pinned me down to the table, along with 4 or 5 other people. My mother was crying in the corner now. Apparently, I had hit her in the face. But still, I could see everything that was going on around me, and the 4 drip was still feeding me ketamine straight to my blood, which went directly to my brain. Now all the masks and gowns, doctors and nurses, didn't look human at all. They looked like monsters, demons even. Sick, twisted, demented creatures that my mom had sold my soul to, and now they were forcibly extracting my soul from my body with that horrible needle. I looked to my mother with bitter contempt and screamed that I hated her for letting this happen to me. It only made her cry harder. No matter how hard I fought back, once they all got a hold of me, I couldn't even squirm. They held me down and finished the spinal tap. When the needle went into my back, it felt like I was being torn apart from the inside, and because I was moving so much, waves of pain shot through my body. Finally, I accepted that I just had to sit still, but it was awful. I could feel my essence being drained, something I would never get back. Thankfully, after a few seconds, it was over, but I wasn't the same. I didn't move for hours after that, and I wouldn't talk to my mother or even look at her. Being drugged and having a needle shoved into my spinal cord as a child is easily the most traumatic thing I've ever experienced in my life, and the stupid thing I hate the most about it is the fact that it was all just to confirm what the doctors basically already knew, that I had spinal meningitis. Story 1: The Terrifying Medical Procedure, continued. I wish I could say that the nightmare ended with the spinal tap, but it was only the beginning of my harrowing experience. After the procedure, I was left in a state of shock and confusion. The ketamine, still coursing through my veins, distorted my perception of reality. Everything around me seemed otherworldly, like a grotesque nightmare. All the masks and gowns worn by the doctors and nurses transformed into monstrous faces, and I felt like I was trapped in a hellish realm. I couldn't move, couldn't escape the vivid hallucinations that the drug induced. My mother, her face now twisted and distorted, tried to comfort me, but I couldn't recognize her anymore. In my altered state, I believed she was complicit in my suffering, that she had willingly handed me over to these monstrous beings. As they held me down, I saw the enormous needle they were about to plunge into my back, and it looked like a weapon of torture. Panic overwhelmed me, and I fought with all my might, screaming, kicking, and thrashing against the restraints of the medical table. It was a desperate attempt to break free from this nightmare, to escape the clutches of these nightmarish creatures. More nurses and doctors rushed in to assist, and they held me down with an inhuman strength. I was powerless, my pleas and screams falling on deaf ears. The ketamine continued to warp my perception, making every moment feel like an eternity of torment. The moment that needle penetrated my skin and entered my spinal cord was excruciating. It was as if I was being torn apart from the inside, and I writhed in agony, waves of pain coursing through my small body. I couldn't even cry out. The pain was so intense that it left me breathless. Finally, as the procedure ended, and the needle was withdrawn, I lay there, drained of all strength, and felt like a mere shell of my former self. My essence had been stripped away, leaving me traumatized and altered forever. When I regained some semblance of awareness, I couldn't move. Hours passed, and I lay there in silence, unable to talk to my mother or even look at her. The ketamine's effects slowly wore off, but the mental scars remained. In the following days and weeks, I struggled to make sense of the nightmare I had endured. The physical pain from the procedure eventually faded, but the emotional scars ran deep. The trust one once had in the medical profession was shattered, and I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. That day in the hospital marked the beginning of a long journey to overcome the trauma I had experienced. It took years of therapy and support from loved ones to help me regain a sense of normalcy and trust in the world. But the memories of that nightmarish ketamine-induced ordeal would haunt me for the rest of my life, a constant reminder of the fragility of innocence and the depths of human suffering. Story 2: The Haunting Abandoned Hospital. When I was a teenager, there was an old abandoned hospital that had been built in the 1800s, long since replaced and left to rot. It couldn't be torn down as it was a historical site, but it also couldn't be repurposed. Ever since it was condemned, nobody took it upon themselves to be the caretaker of the place. Security was basically non-existent, so it became a rite of passage in my neighborhood to hop the fence on Halloween and explore the ruins. Finally, the time came when my friends and I got the bug, and we knew we were going to be the next to do it. We didn't even bother to wear costumes. Nobody wanted to go trick-or-treating or go to a party. The coolest party in town was me and my friends on the roof of the old hospital. All we needed to do was figure out a way up and avoid the numerous hazards along the way, the rumors of which were boasted about to a great extent by all the people who had already gone through it. From broken glass, rusty nails, squatters, to trapdoors, collapsing ceilings, and even ghosts supposedly. Understandably, we were all a bit nervous, but excited too. It was the coolest thing any of us had ever done, and it seemed like there was even an entire path laid out for us by the people who did it before. The door at the front entrance was already broken open, so we just stepped right inside, undeterred. Immediately on the first story was a treehouse center. It was too dark, even with our flashlights, to see very far down the hallway, and the staircase was right there. Not much was happening on that level, so we opted not to bother exploring the bottom and move on to the second of 3 stories. The ceiling had collapsed in on itself at the landing of the second story, so we went out from there to look for another stairwell. The second story was somehow even darker, and the floor beneath our feet was soft and felt like it could cave in at any moment, so we spread out to distribute our weight. We thought we were being smart staying quiet, but pointing out all the things we noticed, like piles of old medical waste, strange stacks of beds blocking off certain doorways, we dared not even think of entering, signs indicating what had been, so we could get a picture of how the place might have looked in its prime. Certainly, it was far from it by the time we arrived. Mold grew up the walls, vines snaked through the ceiling tiles, and water dripped from the third floor. In every single sound we made echoed, in such a way that made it sound like a stranger was whispering around every corner. We kept saying how cool we found everything, but deep down, I think we were all scared. The last thing any of us wanted was for a crazy hobo to jump out at us for invading his home, or for one of the many ghost stories about the supposedly haunted hospital to somehow turn out to be true. Even decades after it had closed, and even to naive and careless boys like us, we could literally feel the lingering presence of the suffering and damned souls that had perished in the place we were trespassing. However, the only thing that lived there seemed to be rats and flies, not nearly as many as we were expecting. After a few more minutes of checking things out, we finally reached the other side of the building and found another stairwell. This one went all the way up to the roof. Once we stepped into the damp concrete tube, we could hear and feel the outside air blowing in through an open door or a hatch, whichever one it was. We picked up our pace as we went up the stairs, excited to see the view. We barely noticed the moss that was growing on the steps, which slickened the grip we had under our shoes. Finally, at the very top of the stairwell, there it was, the open door. At the landing before it, we all paused to take a mental image of the sight. As luck would have it, the moon was shining right through it. If any of us had brought a camera, it would have made a legendary photo. At last, it was only a moment of appreciation before we all wanted to finish our journey. Out of the four of us, I was the last in line at the stairs. A friend of mine was leading the pack as we all went up in single file, and we were just seconds away from reaching the rooftop. But then the last thing we could have expected happened. Out of nowhere, a flurry of bats exploded from a nest we hadn't seen. My friend at the top got startled and slipped on the moss and fell back, causing a chain reaction that led us to all fall like dominoes. 3 of my friends landed on top of me, and my head crashed right onto the concrete. That's the last thing I remember before waking up in a real hospital. I had cracked my head wide open and fractured my skull, and my friends had to carry me all the way out of that abandoned wreck and get help for me. It took me a while to accept what had happened, and sadly, it seemed that none of us managed to get to the roof of the abandoned hospital like we had hoped that night. But I'm glad I had good enough friends to help me out when I needed it. To this day, a lot of people don't believe me when I say that's exactly what happened and why I fell. They say bats don't stay in their nests at night, but I guess even nocturnal flying mammals like to sleep in sometimes. I'm not an expert, it's just what I saw. Story 2. The Haunting Abandoned Hospital, continued. My friends and I had embarked on a treacherous adventure into the dark depths of the abandoned hospital, only to be met with unforeseen dangers. After my fall on the staircase, I woke up in a real hospital with a fractured skull, my head bandaged and throbbing with pain. The transition from the eerie and decaying hospital to the sterile, well-lit environment of the medical facility felt surreal. My friends had managed to carry me out of the abandoned place and get help in time. The doctors told me that I was lucky to be alive, considering the severity of my head injury. The fall had been a terrifying ordeal, and I couldn't help but think of the ominous atmosphere we had encountered in that forsaken hospital. As I lay in the hospital bed, recovering from my injuries, I couldn't help but reflect on the events of that fateful night. The abandoned hospital had held a certain allure, a mystery that had drawn us in like moths to a flame. We had expected thrills and chills, but we had never anticipated the genuine peril that awaited us. I couldn't help but wonder about the history of that forsaken place. What had transpired within those decaying walls? The thought of the suffering and pain that may have occurred there sent shivers down my spine. My friends visited me in the hospital, expressing their relief that I was alive. They recounted the events of that night, how they had rushed to get me medical attention, and the guilt they felt for leading me into such a dangerous situation. We all agreed that our curiosity had nearly cost me my life, and we vowed never to venture into such hazardous places again. As I recovered, I began to research the abandoned hospital, hoping to uncover its dark secrets. The more I delved into its history, the more chilling stories I uncovered. Tales of patients who had suffered there, rumors of experiments gone awry, and the inexplicable events that had plagued the place for decades. I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent still lingered within those decaying walls. Perhaps it was the residual energy of the pain and suffering that had occurred there, or maybe something more sinister had taken root. I knew that I had narrowly escaped a dreadful fate, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease whenever I thought about that night. In the end, my friends and I had learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of our curiosity. The abandoned hospital served as a haunting reminder of the thin line between adventure and peril, between fascination and terror. Though we had escaped with our lives, we would forever carry the memories of that ill-fated exploration, a chilling chapter in our lives that would never be forgotten.